It's 2026. It's a new year. This is a podcast. This, in fact, more specifically, is Beyond the Limits. I'm Mike Forsyth. Matt Clark's here. Matt, welcome to the show.
Wow, I love that, Mike. I love the new year, the new enthusiasm. We are back. I love it.
We are back. And actually, we've got loads of exciting things to talk about, not only today, but actually in the new year coming up. So I'm starting January with some renewed enthusiasm for this. We're going to have lots of guests. We're going to talk about a load of wellness trends and medical developments and hopefully keep everyone entertained. Thank you, by the way, for all of the feedback we've had recently about our latest episodes. It's really nice to hear people's opinions and suggestions for future episodes, so keep those coming.
I think we've got over 500 subscribers now, which I certainly don't know that many people. Do you know that many people, Mike?
No, but we're big time podcasters now, so I guess we've got to expect that.
Okay, let's move on. Let's get started, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it. So we're going to talk today about heart rate variability. Or I don't know about you, Matt, but I hear about this a lot. It's very much a topic of conversation in the wellness industry. It's a metric that is being encouraged via various fitness apps, smartwatches, what have you. Now, ever since doing some research about it, I've of course been bombarded with a whole load of social media posts around it, and we'll get on to this, but frankly, some of them are utterly ridiculous. But do you want to kick us off first and set the scene here and explain to us what HRV is?
Absolutely. So heart rate variability, what is that? What does that mean? So the variability, it's important to understand this is not just heart rate. So this is not just your heart going slow or your heart rate going fast. This is the variation between slow and fast and how often that happens and how easy it is for your body to do that. Before we talk about the wellness stuff and the implications of this, I thought it'd be good to start back with some of the physiology of why are we looking at heart rate variability and understanding why would that be important. So there are two systems that govern us, the autonomic system and there is conscious control. So the autonomic system, that's an umbrella term for all of the important stuff that the body does in the background without you having any active control. Now, the active control stuff, this is, you deciding what you pick out of the fridge, where you're going to drive to, what you're going to put on that day. The autonomic stuff is all of the important physiology, which helps basically keep us alive. We're going to look specifically at the heart, though, and how fast and how slow it beats and how quickly it changes between those two states. Now, there are two main parts of the autonomic nervous system. Those are known as the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. Now, we've talked a lot about these in the past, but as a kind of general rule of thumb, the parasympathetic nervous system is commonly called the kind of rest and digest. This is the slowing, the calming, the digestion of food, the restocking of the shelves, the restocking of the energy supplies. Whereas the sympathetic is known as the fight or flight. This is the get up and go, you've got to escape the saber-toothed tiger, or in modern day time, this is jumping or grabbing your child from being hit by a car in the middle of the road. This is the immediate stress response that allows you to act quickly and do those important things. I want to talk about the accelerators and the brakes. I've talked about the parasympathetic and the sympathetic control, how those two different systems actually act upon your heart rate and the variability of your heart rate as a byproduct. So the sympathetic activation of the heart rate is the accelerator. This will make your heart rate go up. This makes your heart beat faster, or also makes your heart beat stronger, increases something called the cardiac output. The reason that's important is that if you are running away from saber-toothed tiger or you're getting out of the way of the speeding car, you need to be able to act. You need the energy and the cardiac output that you need the oxygen supply to your muscles to do that. That's the sympathetic accelerator. The brakes, I've talked about the parasympathetic system. This is the slowing of the heart. And this is also equally important. And this happens when you're sleeping, when you're resting, when you're recovering from a training session in the gym. You need to be able to relax and restore the energy levels. That's the parasympathetic control. Now, you might think, well, you've got an accelerator and a brake. It's one or the other. And I'd like to point out that this is a specific system that actually combines the two at the same time. I actually went go-karting a couple of months ago, which was surprisingly good fun. But they tell you at the start you're not allowed to press the brake while pressing accelerator. And there's a reason being behind that is that, first of all, it's stupid. But also your wheels will spin and the car won't work. But this is a completely different system, and it's a very finely balanced, finely tuned system that requires the delicate balance of both of these systems operating simultaneously. Now, why am I mentioning all this, Mike?
I don't know. I was going to ask why you're going go-karting as someone who's nearly 40.
Honestly, it's good fun. But these two systems that govern the heart rate also dictate the variability of the heart rate. Now, when the parasympathetic system, when you are kind of recovering, relaxing, you're sleeping, the variability of your heart rate is much higher. And this gives us this number, this critical number that we're going to talk about later, which is the HRV. When you are in a stressed or excited or accelerated state, you have lots of stress hormones running around, you've got the cortisol, adrenaline that's causing your heart rate to go up. Your heart rate variability actually comes down a lot, and there is less variability between the beats compared to when you are resting and relaxing. And we'll come on to why that distinction is important and the implications of having a high HRV versus a low HRV later.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to labour somewhat. Is I think there's this misconception that actually having a steady heart rate means that you're in good health, where actually in reality a healthy heart rate is highly variable. So I think it's important to mention that point. I'm glad you've touched upon that. So it's not quite so simple as a high heart rate variability being good and a low heart rate variability being bad, but broadly that's what we're looking at in those kind of stressful responses. When you're overly stressed in those rest situations, you're potentially more likely to have the low variability in your heart rate.
And did you know, Mike, obviously we can now transplant human hearts, which is incredible, and a whole another episode to talk about that, how amazing that is. But what happens when a heart transplant happens is that it completely loses these accelerators and these brakes. It just becomes this metronome driven by something called the sinoatrial node, which is a collection of cells in everyone's heart which drives this metronome. When it's lost the innervation by the nervous control, so this parasympathetic and sympathetic control I talked about, it just beats at a donk, donk, donk. It doesn't change. Whereas in our native heart and our native system, we have this very delicate and very responsive control that we talked about, which allows us to respond to those certain situations.
Yeah, I read somewhere that rather than being a metronome, our heart is more like a jazz drummer, which I quite liked. We always come back to these orchestral analogies on the show, but I think that was a quite nice description for me.
Very good, very good.
So why don't we talk about how we measure HRV? So it's all very well talking about what it is. If I want to know what my individual HRV is, how do I go about that?
Yeah, so really interestingly, my research led me down a few rabbit holes here, and HRV was discovered in the 1700s, and there's this incredible literature review which cites these kind of Greek physicians that are finding this, and how this has been known about for a long time and studied in many different physiological and disease states, such as women in labour and fetal heart rates when the fetus is distressed. And kind of rather upsettingly, I think HRV is now commonplace and has come to the fore through brands like Whoop, which are very much driving that it is the all-seeing, all-knowing metric that everyone needs to obsess over. But it's interesting that this has been studied and known about for a long time. How do we actually measure it? So the most accurate way is with an ECG. An electrocardiogram is a reading on a trace of paper, and it looks at the electrical activity of your heart. And it's a very sensitive way of measuring HRV by looking between these spikes on an ECG, so the R waves, and measuring the distance between the two over a period of time, and then using a formula to calculate your HRV. And the reason that's relevant is that the different watches and the different bits of tech actually use different formulas. So again, which one's most accurate and which one's most commonly used. The other thing that's really important in terms of how do we measure HRV. So again, noting Whoop or Fitbit or your Aura Ring or your Apple Watch, these use optical sensors which actually look at the capillary blood flow and measure, obviously when your heart is beating, it's pushing blood into your limbs, and that kind of pulse of blood that reaches the fingertip or the wrist, it literally uses a light to detect when that wave of blood happens. And you can imagine that is fraught with inaccuracies without kind of needing an explanation. But if you're tattooed, or if you're in a different light setting, or if you're moving around or running, for example, or jiggling around while you're on your stationary exercise bike, these are not very accurate. It's measured in milliseconds, so the reason it's measured in time is it's the gap between those R waves, or the gap between that pulse of blood that's hitting the finger. And there are normal ranges for this. And a quick note on normal ranges, because interestingly, if someone is an athlete, for example, then the HRV is noted to be higher, and also younger patients have a higher HRV as well. However, it's a slightly arbitrary value because you can have one athlete who is competing in the same, 400-meter relay race to another athlete, but their HRV can be leagues apart, which I thought was interesting.
So I guess that nicely summarizes how we measure it, what it is. Now, why is it actually relevant? Why does it matter? And as I alluded to at the start, it really has become a metric that people have been very interested in, and particularly in the wellness industry. When you mentioned Whoop, there are various other companies that are pushing this as something that we all should know and we all should be aware about. Now, it's probably breaking these down into two parts, really, which is the relationship between HRV and general disease, and then moving on to the relevance to optimizing exercise and recovery. And that's the aspect that a lot of these companies are pushing. But just to touch on diseases, perhaps the single strongest piece of evidence for HRV is its use in cardiology. So a low HRV following a heart attack is a powerful independent predictor of higher mortality and morbidity. There's some really strong evidence for that being the case. So in a medical setting, that is potentially useful. Now, there are some other interesting relationships with HRV and disease. So mental health, there's actually a clear inverse relationship. So chronic stress, anxiety, depression, they're again associated with a persistently lowered HRV. This perhaps shows this physiological burden of psychological stress. And then low HRV, I believe, is implicated in various chronic conditions. So diabetes, hypertension. And I think that's really reflective, perhaps, of the body's reduced ability to regulate itself. So a lot of these are observational or show correlation. As I said, particularly when it comes to diseases, that cardiology setting is where the really good evidence is there for HRV.
Yeah, and there's a few other interesting use cases. A lot of this has been studied about women in labour or the anticipation of labour by measuring HRV. And there's a really interesting paper that was published last year, actually, that I found on this. It was the first one to study HRV properly with ECGs, for example, and using that to anticipate when a woman is going to go into labour. And obviously that's something that can be quite random, quite difficult to predict. The delicate balance between hormones that triggers a woman to go into labour when they're approaching the term. And they found a really strong negative correlation between HRV and the time to labour. And there are some other interesting things in there as well, which I can put it in the footnotes if anyone wants to dig deeper into this. But this idea that the parasympathetic system actually kind of takes over in anticipation of labour. The theory behind that is that you need to rebuild the building blocks. You need to rest and recover and conserve energy before going into what is then a sympathetic drive, which then reduces the HRV, which is measured in this paper, which is then triggered by going into labour. So it was an interesting kind of window into the prediction of certain states. And again, you've talked about some specific diseases there. I think it's important to mention that there is quite good evidence as well that HRV declines when someone's poorly. So when you get a virus or when you've had a heavy training session, and the reason being is that you are recovering and that your cortisol levels, your adrenaline levels aren't necessarily spiking because you're running away from a threat, but they are higher because you have done something exertional and you need to recover. And there is this state of stress that you've put your body in, and that is reflected in your HRV, which then reduces when you are stressed. And if you are chronically stressed, chronically running high levels of cortisol or high levels of adrenaline, that is not good, and that doesn't do you good over the long run for many reasons. It's a higher risk of dementia, etc., and this can be implicated by having a lower HRV, because when you are stressed, your HRV will be less.
Exactly right. I mean, it's probably worth pointing out this can work the other way. So actually, if you are unwell, you spike a fever, sometimes you can actually see that your HRV, if you're measuring this, jumps above your baseline. So just worth bearing that in mind, I think, as well.
Yeah, and to take that point one step further, when not to use HRV is there are certain disease states, aren't there, where HRV is not a helpful indicator. And that, say, for example, if you have been studying your HRV for a long period and you notice a sudden abrupt change in your HRV, this can actually be an indicator of a significant disease state that nullifies the use of measuring your HRV. Say, for example, an arrhythmia. So when we talked about the metronome that governs whether it's a jazz drum or a metronome, when that suddenly changes because of, say, you have developed a condition called atrial fibrillation, which is quite common in later life, then of course your HRV is completely a useless metric because the metronome or the jazz drummist has decided to play the flute instead.
And this moves us on to the use in recovery and in sports science to optimize training load. So the theory is that once you've analyzed and worked out your individual HRV, you can then use that to assess your ability to train and your readiness to train. So a sudden significant drop in what your baseline HRV is can perhaps indicate that you're overreaching or you're overtraining and actually require an extra day's rest. So this is where there's been a huge amount of interest, because the feeling is if you've got this individual marker that can basically say to you, rather than just thinking, how do you feel? Are you ready to train? You've got an objective marker that you can look at that says, you know what? You've done quite a lot this week. You need a day off. Otherwise, you're going to overtrain and cause problems.
This is where my interest really peaked, because we have these wearable devices now that are ubiquitous. A note on these optical sensors that they're not that useful when you're exercising, they're not that useful when you're rushing around, but when you're sleeping or when you're just waking up in the morning, that data can be useful in terms of measuring or giving an indication on your HRV. And that's something that, everyone has got on their wrist now. And I think this is interesting in terms of, could this be a useful metric that guides our activity of that day and whether or not, we're well enough to take on a big challenge, like you said. And I think it falls down here a little bit, because I wanted to believe that this was helpful, but I think there are other metrics that might be more helpful in understanding how fit we are or how relatively fit we are compared to last week. So, for example, our intra-training fitness, and I'll touch on a few of those different metrics now. A quick note on the variation between athletes as well, because if we're looking at HRV as, hang on, here's my score, this is how fit I am, I don't think that really stands up, because you can have this gulf of difference between, like I said, one athlete performing in the same event as another, and they're having HRV, which is, 2-3 standard deviations different from the rest of the training field, but it doesn't mean that they're any less capable or competent. Let's compare this to, say, for example, VO2 max testing that we've talked about previously. VO2 max is obviously inconvenient, and getting a proper test done is difficult. But I think it gives you a very comprehensive number in terms of how cardiovascularly fit you are, i.e. how much oxygen you can consume when exercising. It's a really good barometer of like, okay, here is the line in the sand. And that's comparable between people and between populations, whereas HRV falls down there, despite it being much easier to measure and collect data on. I think VO2 max is a much better marker of how fit someone is, and also has a much stronger correlation with someone's all-cause mortality. And if you want to learn more about that, then I would encourage anyone to go back and listen to that episode. The other one I think it's worth comparing this to is something called heart rate recovery. And that is, say, for example, you've got a selection of athletes, and I actually know someone who works with the Welsh national football team, and I'm aware that they actually use this in terms of, is someone fit to play? And it's a case of getting them on the exercise bike, they push them to a certain level, and then they literally measure how quickly does their heart rate recover. And that's an indication of, again, these kind of stress states that we talked about, and how efficiently are their lungs and muscles clearing lactic acid and replenishing those oxygen stores. The one thing that I think it's useful for, specifically compared to these other metrics, is a predictor of fatigue. So if someone hasn't fully recovered, if they haven't had a replenishing night's sleep, for example, they haven't let their parasympathetic system fully take over, the vagal nerve stimulation of their heart hasn't fully brought that heart rate down to this nice low level where the variability is much higher, this can be an indication of, well, actually that person probably isn't going to perform at their best because they're not well rested and they're not in that state where their heart rate variability is high. And I found that really interesting, and that could be, and it is used particularly in the States. There's a company called Morpheus who's kind of driving this whole movement, and I've actually got a friend who I was discussing this with at the pub, and he was saying that he wears a Whoop, and I was saying, is it any good? What does it do? And he's just, this is very observational data, but he's noticed that it does tell him when he's about to get ill or whether he is not particularly on his game. And he says he notices that when he then goes to the gym and he tries to do a workout, and he's like, well, actually that was rubbish. I wasn't really on my game and I wasn't really feeling up to it. And it's almost like his watch was telling him that before he even went through the door. Is that useful? I don't know. Do you need your watch to tell you that? Some people will feel that yes, they do, and that data is helpful, whereas some people might just say, well, actually, no, I kind of know that I'm not on my game today.
Yeah, that's the area, I think, of all of this that I've found quite interesting, and perhaps it is the area where I've looked at and thought, you know what, this could be pretty good. I mean, I think probably less relevant for most people. I mean, I tend to know that I'm in no position to exercise because I've been up all night with the kids, or I had 2 glasses of wine the night before. I'm just chronically tired. I don't really need a watch to tell me a number. But I think if you're someone who is a high achieving or elite athlete, and you're training a lot, potentially having this metric that is individual for you that you can look at and you can think, you know what, I've actually got quite a big drop in my HRV. I've measured it correctly. It's the right time of day to do that. And actually, maybe things aren't quite right. And actually, I need to modify my training or rest for another day. So I think there is a role here. I mean, it does remind me, you talking about VO2 max. It reminds me of that in a sense, because it is a number that is being provided by a smartwatch that is trying to replicate something that can be measured very accurately with a medical examination. And that number, everyone loves numbers at the moment. Everybody loves tech. Everyone wants to know where they stand fitness-wise. So I think that's the attraction to it. But certainly, I think you're right. That predictor of fatigue, I think, is potentially where this could have a role.
But on that note, yeah, I mean, you're right. Yeah, data is not for everyone, is it? Is it? I think me and you don't really need, like you say, a watch to tell us that we're knackered. That, in fact, it's almost a bit of an insult when you wake up at 5 o'clock and your watch is beeping at you saying that your sleep's poor and that your HRV is low. So, Mike, lead us on then. Let's just briefly talk about how we might actually improve upon our HRV.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think there's an important distinction I want to make first, because this will lead to me potentially having a bit of a rant about this. There is very much a difference between proving that number that your fancy watch is giving you and actually improving your HRV. I'm going to run through these briefly. There are a few things that you can do that probably are going to affect your HRV. So we've talked about that kind of imbalance between your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system. So we want to activate that parasympathetic nervous system in most cases. So some deep breathing meditation, doing some coherence breathing. That's a kind of proven immediate way to stimulate the vagus nerve. That in turn can boost your HRV. Moderate to vigorous aerobic exercise can have the same effect. Sleep hygiene, so sleeping well. Look, all of these sound really obvious because they are really obvious, but they are still beneficial. Interestingly, a cold exposure. So one of our earliest episodes that we did at Beyond the Limits was about cold water immersion. These kind of brief, intense cold exposures, so cold showers, cold plunges, that again can activate the parasympathetic nervous system and improve your HRV. So there are things that you can do. My real objection to this, and particularly what I've seen all the time in social media, is this obsession with improving this number, as though if you improve this number that appears on your wrist, everything is going to be better. And obviously, this is looking at this from completely the wrong angle. HRV is a metric. It is reflective of your autonomic nervous system, if you will. It is not something that if you do a few deep breaths, your number pops up and it's improved, that suddenly everything is going to be fine. And I want to read you something, Matt, because I saved this on social media because it annoyed me so much. But this is from a company that I'm not going to name, and I'm going to briefly read to you what they have said on their social media advert. Most men ignore low... I don't know why I'm doing the voice, but I'm going to do the voice anyway.
No, do the voice.
Most men ignore low HRV until weak pelvic muscles start ruining their men's health. And then we have a quote. I thought my pelvic pain was from sitting too long or prostate issues, but it turned out to be my low HRV. My muscles stayed tight all the time, creating hypertonus and blocking blood flow. Then I found, insert company name here, a science-based plan designed to restore your drive, reduce muscle tension, and improve stamina. So this is the kind of shite that you get, where people are actually genuinely believing that if they work on this number, it's this quick fix, this quick hack that maybe boosts up their number for a second, or maybe it boosts up for the day, that suddenly that's going to improve everything in your body, your stress, your anxiety levels, your tight hamstrings, your general dissatisfaction with your life. And that is my rant. In fact, I had an analogy as well. So imagine you've got bad skin, you've got acne, you've got spots, you've got uneven skin, it's blotchy. Now, one way you could deal with that would be to address your skincare. You could get some products, you could eat well, all of these things. Or you could lather your face with makeup. And now, you may feel a little bit better. People may look at you and they say, oh, your skin looks better. And you may feel briefly better about it in terms of your self-esteem, but it's not addressing the underlying issue. And I think this is this kind of shortcut approach, very similar with HRV, where we're saying, this is a number, I want to make this number better. Companies are encouraging you to do this because they think everything is going to be fine. And it's just getting that understanding. This is a metric. This is a number that may be helpful in terms of looking at fatigue. What it is not is this magic shortcut to optimizing your life.
Wow, crikey. You really took the gloves off there. I enjoyed that. That was about 3 minutes, I'd say.
That myself was there.
Good. Got a bit hot under the collar. But no, I think you're making a really good point. It's almost an observation, isn't it, of health problems. And rather than focusing on the health problem, people can focus on the number. And it's the wrong way around, isn't it? In fact, you're right. I listened to a whole podcast that was talking about how to improve your HRV. And it was saying things like sleep and obstructive sleep apnea can cause your HRV to be reduced. So getting your sleep apnea addressed can improve your HRV. And it's like, yeah, but who cares about your HRV? Getting your sleep apnea, addressed will improve your sleep and will make you feel great. And the HRV is a bystander that will improve, and it's not the end goal. But yes, okay, I think we've laboured that point enough, haven't we? We've talked about what can improve it. Generally, living a better life will improve HRV, and we should all be striving to live a better life, not be having a better HRV.
I could have just said that and saved everyone 3 minutes, but apologies, that was much more succinct.
We've talked about wearable tech and we've talked about a few brands, but I don't want to be ranting cynical for the whole episode. And I guess I just want to make a quick point on how great I think a lot of these products are. You can get an ECG done now with your Apple Watch by literally touching a few points on the watch. I don't have an Apple Watch, but family member of mine has had some heart problems in the past, and it's just amazing how useful this technology is. And obviously, it's going to create a few problems and a few red herrings, but I just think it's great how this technology is removing barriers in terms of, say, for example, we talked about atrial fibrillation before. I've got patients coming to me being like, this is a bit weird. This patient I'm thinking of in particular didn't have any symptoms. And they came with this thing that basically gave us a diagnosis. And we then further investigated with, more reliable tests and diagnosed this patient with a condition that was literally picked up by their watch. And I have another patient who we talk about his watch every time he comes. He's saying, this is what I did in the gym. This is what happened. What do we need to do? And we're kind of fine tuning his training plan. And, a lot of his health stuff the conversation is all around the watch. And I just think it's amazing. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this, Mike.
Yeah, totally. I think you're right. I think it is improving access in a lot of ways, and it is empowering people who want to be quite health conscious. Now, clearly there are potential downsides to that. I mean, I've certainly had patients who have brought in months and months of heart rate printouts in terms of what their particular smartwatch is telling them their heart rate was at every moment of the day. And that clearly is not going to be helpful. That's going to lead to a lot of health anxiety, potentially a lot of fixation about things that are ultimately not important. But the other side of the coin is exactly right. I think the tech, and actually it's it's pretty accurate as well with a lot of these things, isn't it? Look, they're probably not gold standard, but certainly the research I was doing, with Whoop devices going back to HRV, it's not bad. Done the right way, I think it's pretty reflective and pretty accurate. So, they are amazing in many ways, and I don't really understand them, but I think there are benefits there as long as they're used in the right way.
Okay, let's do a quick fire round. Let's do some myth busting then, Mike. I'm going to give you a few statements, and I want you to bust some myths for me. So, statement 1, a high HRV is always better.
Yeah, I like these. Okay, so this is, I would say, a myth. So the reality here is that, as we've touched upon, HRV should be interpreted relative to your own personal baseline. So a sudden massive jump above your baseline can sometimes indicate an illness or a fever, as we talked about, or that your body is kind of working hard to fight something off. Normal fluctuations are healthy, and I guess consistency is key.
Good. Very nice. Okay, next one. The HRV score on my watch is diagnostic.
Yeah, I don't really know what that statement means, to be honest. Diagnostic of what? But I'll go with, ultimately, I suppose this is a myth. Again, now wearables, as we've just touched upon, they are pretty good. They're quite good for tracking trends, daily changes relative to your own baseline. Look, they're not medical grade devices. They shouldn't be used for diagnosis. To get a proper HRV measurement, you need chest electrodes, specific protocols, doing ECGs ultimately to do that. So yeah, that's not a great question, but that's probably a correct answer. Let me fire a couple at you. So I need to measure my HRV constantly throughout the day.
No, you don't. No, hang on.
Thank you.
What am I
Perfect.
saying? Is that enough? No, hang on, let me clarify. So no is the short answer, but some people might want to do that. So yeah, that's totally fine. It might cause, like you said, a bit of anxiety if you're studying endlessly a metric that is a bystander indicator of your health. But it's also important to say that actually measuring your HRV, particularly if you're doing it with an Oura Ring or a Whoop device or a watch, then it's not going to be accurate during the day when you're rushing about. It might be accurate overnight when you're sleeping or in the morning when you're resting. That's probably when you want to look at it.
Yeah, exactly right. So I think the advice is to take that reading first thing in the morning whilst you're still lying down. That's going to be the most accurate reading you're getting. Okay, last one from me. And I think probably we've touched upon this before, but I'll ask you anyway. So the ultimate goal should be to get your HRV as high as possible.
No. Have you done this? What's your HRV?
Oh, I have no idea. I don't have a watch that can do that. Or if it does, I don't know how to work it.
Fine. Actually,
what about you?
No, I don't either. I don't.
That was a good segment.
Good segment. Right, let's keep that one in. No, don't get it as high as possible. Sometimes a higher HRV can be an indication that you are in a healthier moment because you have less stress in your life and that your parasympathetic system is in higher tone compared to your sympathetic, which can mean that you're in a state of rest and that you don't have much stress and that you are recovered. But getting your HRV as high as possible, I think, is, like we've said, is not directing your energy in the right place, and you should be focusing on what specific ailments that you might have.
Very good, very good. Okay, we've myth busted, we've done some physiology, and I've had a big old rant. Just to close off, Matt, give me your takeaway points on this.
Yes, I think HRV can be interesting in certain specific use cases. I think as a marker of fitness, I think there are other metrics which are much better, and I think HRV is actually not that helpful. It may be helpful in indicating whether you're off form, slightly ill, or overtrained. I think everyone needs to be aware that measuring it, how you measure it, is important, and that with a chest strap or with an ECG is going to be much more accurate than using your wristwatch or your Whoop device or Oura Ring in certain situations. And yeah, we certainly should be focusing on how we can make ourselves healthier rather than how we can get our HRV number to be better.
Very good. I'm going to save everyone a lot of time and say that's pretty much my takeaway too. I feel like we always often conclude the same things in these episodes, but I would say the same thing with HRV. Don't believe everything you read on social media about how this is going to be a panacea to a wonderful 2026 and beyond. Because again, if it sounds too good to be true, it potentially is. And I think fixating on getting this HRV number high at the expense of everything else is the road to nowhere ultimately.
Great. Well, Mike, I will wrap things up there. So 2026, we've got a lot of exciting episodes lined up and some great guests. Looking forward to those. If you think we talk some sense, then please do subscribe, share this with a friend, give us an email or a comment so that we can look at that next episode. Buy us a coffee. You can now do so at buymeacoffee.com/beyond the limits. It all helps to keep our show great.
Cheers, Matt.